Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's event. I'm Anne Franca, the Chief Executive of the CMI, and today I'm delighted to be sharing with you the findings of our important research, Management Transformed, Managing in a Marathon Crisis. We've polled over 2,300 people, a mix of senior leaders, managers, and employees, to find out how they were coping in this marathon crisis, how their own work and management responsibilities have changed, and the specific areas in which they and the UK management community need support. Now, originally, we assumed, as many people did, that the physical location of where you worked and whether your business or organization was facing increased demand or falling demand would make a big difference to how you like to be led and managed and to your productivity. But actually, it turned out we were wrong. And what we found is it's not really where you work, but the way in which you do it that really matters to people and determines your success. Now, I'm delighted to be joined by a distinguished panel of guests to discuss the findings of Management Transformed and the implications for leaders and managers at all levels, and to offer practical advice that can help you to continue to steer yourselves and your teams through the COVID crisis. We'll also consider what the future of management looks like post-pandemic, what aspects will be changed forever by our experiences, and what we can do to prepare for that practically now. But first, I'd like to share with you a very brief video that goes through the main findings of our Management Transformed research. So if I could have that video now, please. So some really interesting findings there. And to comment on these findings, I'd now like to introduce CMI's president, Lord Mark Price, to share his views on the research.
Good morning. I'm sorry that I'm not able to join you live this morning for the launch of our Management Transformed report. But I feel it's important to share with you my thoughts about this incredibly important piece of research, its findings, and how it can help managers and leaders navigate their teams through these unprecedented times. Specifically, I want to share my thoughts on three questions which struck me as I read the report. Firstly, how do you keep employees engaged? Secondly, what does culture mean? And thirdly, what is good management? So, first of all, how do you keep managers engaged? The role of the manager is to build a relationship based on trust with every individual on your team. When you have that relationship, you can give and take honest feedback. and you can understand how to work together most efficiently. Moreover, the research found that where managers trust their direct reports, they reported that productivity rises. Where managers say they don't trust their direct reports, they were more likely to say their direct reports were less productive. I believe that sharing information is the single most important thing you can do to help people feel engaged and to give people responsibility for the joint goals of the organisation. This was borne out by the research, which found that effective communication skills are the most valued managerial trait for this crisis. In fact, 95% of those surveys say that communicating clearly is the most important trait of all right now. The method of that communication is also more important than ever. Now people have the setup to work from home. Why not contact them at all hours and get the report you need right now? You know they have access to it. That is obviously not the right way to go. And at CMI, we have been concerned about reports of surveillance management, which will never get the best out of people. Setting the parameters for effective communication is more important than ever, and empowering people to ignore emails until their working hours is a key aspect of this. What does culture mean? Much of the way you keep your team engaged will simultaneously inform your company's culture and draw from it. One of the best descriptions of culture I've ever heard is that it's the sediment of past transactions. But again, this year, we see such a break with the way we traditionally have done things. How do you maintain and evolve your company culture is a fascinating question. In the past, company culture was as much learnt through osmosis by watching colleagues and being told we don't do it that way, as it is from being given the company manual. But with that kind of social interaction currently limited, companies must find new and creative ways to teach and reinforce their culture. Whether that's well-being days off, virtual quiz nights, supporting local charities, or pivoting services to support the fight against the pandemic, companies need to stand up and explicitly say, we're doing X because Y is important to us. Our research shows that communication and flexible working help to sustain culture, but it's a shared sense of belonging, social ties, and organisational values that help create it. This is important because organisations that have fostered a sense of belonging and make efforts to bring people together during the crisis say their culture has benefited as a result. One area that is now more important than ever is that of inclusivity in the workplace. We know that in some cases, the pandemic has created and exacerbated long-standing gaps between the experiences and priorities of certain groups. Only 10% of employees rank the diversity of the workforce in their organisation as a critical workplace priority before the pandemic, dropping to 7% as we emerge from the first lockdown. By contrast, these figures for Black managers were 39% and 35% respectively. If managers want to keep Black colleagues engaged, they're going to have to do more than talk the talk on this issue. From a company culture point of view, the company needs to look critically at how they address career promotion, progression, training, who we role model within the company, and who we mentor. What is good management? Management is really hard. If all you had to do was work on a spreadsheet and watch your budget, then that's easy. Most people can do that. But building meaningful bonds, thinking about how best to get your team to deliver and how to keep them engaged, that is the crux of good management. So to close, today we're looking at the transformation of management across a turbulent year. I want to leave you with a question. What remains the same? What is the foundation of good management which all of the new ways of communicating and disruptive technologies sit upon? My answer, which isn't definitive, and as the title of this research says, this is a marathon and we're still in the middle of it, is that good management is about recognizing the individual and building that special relationship. and constantly encouraging individuals to share their ideas, ask and give honest feedback, and being prepared to listen to an alternate point of view. Whatever 2021 throws at us, this is what we strive for. Thank you.
So some very wise words there from Lord Mark Price. And now I'm delighted to welcome my very distinguished panel to discuss some of the findings of the research. And joining me now are Bruce Carnegie Brown, the chair of Lloyd's and also CMI's past president, Sally Penny, MBE, the barrister and founder of Women in Law UK, Dr. Adam Marshall, the Director General of the British Chambers of Commerce, and Maggie Buggy, the Chief Business Officer of the global technology company SAP. Welcome, everybody. So I'm going to start with you, Bruce. We did find in the research that people can be productive wherever they're working, whether in the office, remotely, or a mix. What do you think some of the longer term implications of this are for how businesses will operate in the future?
Thank you, Anne. I mean, I think businesses have responded extraordinarily well through this crisis to different ways of working, and that's a terrific positive. And I think we've all been prioritizing the welfare of our employees above everything else, which again is a terrific positive. But I think it's time for businesses to begin thinking about the longer term future and some of the opportunities that have come out of this crisis in terms of more flexible working. And one of my challenges is that I think when everybody is working remotely or everyone's working physically, it's a pretty democratic environment. But when you have a mix of people in the room and people joining remotely, it breaks down. And I think we've got to find a way to make sure that even when we're back to a more, what I call mixed economy of the physical and the remote, that the people who are working remotely continue to be fully included in the way business works. And typically, conversations end up getting dominated by the people in the room. And so I think there's a real challenge for managers to try to make this mixed economy work on a permanent basis. And everybody responds well in a crisis. But of course, this is now, as the title suggests, a marathon for us. And we've got to learn to adapt to long-term changes in our ways of working. And there are a huge number of advantages that I think have come out of this. Nobody that I've met has complained about missing their commute to work, for instance. And so how do we capture some of those benefits in terms of improved working environment for people, but at the same time maintain the ability to kind of get the job done on a day-to-day basis? So there's lots to look forward to, I think, but management has to be really proactive about seizing that opportunity.
Sure. And Maggie, my next question is for you. We heard from Mark that we don't want a surveillance economy where technology is used to keep tabs on people, and that trust is absolutely fundamental to building relationships with your team. But what is your view on how you build trust in this environment where so many of us are working remotely? And are there ways that technology can help with that?
Well, absolutely, and we don't want a surveillance culture. That's a race to the bottom for everyone. But to your question, look, we've all seen this year that technology has enabled us to keep our businesses running, keep our communities running, and most importantly, in the context of COVID, to help us save lives. That said, I think now is the perfect time for this report to come out, because whilst technology is the big enabler, it is the channel, it is not the underlying culture. And to really help businesses as we look forward now to 2021 and the management community to thrive, we need to think about what are the possibilities presented by the fusion of technology and more physical world interactions. And that is fundamental to how we're able to build trust in these environments. So for instance, not everything needs to be on screen. That is something that we learned in SAP globally, that we're at a point now that we need to mix up between when is the right time to use voice, when is the right time to use video. Also, how are we being absolutely creative about using workshop tools in the context of meetings? We've also had an opportunity to reset and think about what is the optimum duration of a meeting. For instance, at SAP globally, we've set our global systems that you can only set your calendar time to be, say, 25-minute meetings or 50-minute meetings, allowing our people to have time to kind of have a bit of a break between the flow of what can, in some cases, be, a full day spent in front of the screen. And also, I think the opportunity presented by sentiment analysis and tools that help monitor that provide more actionable, emotional insight for managers to adapt the way in which they're engaging with people. So I'd say those things as first thoughts.
Some great examples there. Shorter meetings. Now, Adam, you obviously work with thousands of businesses up and down the country. What examples of innovation in how business leaders have coped with this crisis have you seen? And in particular, what examples of innovative management can you share with us?
Well, it's interesting, Anne, that some of the best examples of good management we've heard throughout the crisis actually involve going back to older ways of doing things and reinvigorating them. Maggie mentioned the need to look at different channels and how you use them over the course of a day, because it can be very hard to read the room over video after a while, particularly when people are tired or if they decide not to engage physically with the camera that they've got in front of them. The old-fashioned phone call, on the other hand, can let you read someone's voice. And we've heard of quite a lot of business people up and down the country finding a reason just to pick up the phone to their direct reports, sometimes to ask them how they were personally, to ask them about their families, or to deal with a more minor management issue that may have arisen over the course of a day. And in doing so, they are able to get more to the big issues that are actually worrying or bothering some of those individuals, the strategic issues. They may not have been able to do that if they were stuck in an all-day video conference environment. Similarly, a lot of people have become more adept, I think, at reading silence than they perhaps were previously. When you had silence and body language, people would jump to a conclusion fairly quickly. When you have silence and a two-dimensional person in front of you, it's different. It's harder to evaluate, but people have become more adept at doing it. And I think for a lot of leaders who are high on IQ and low on EQ, they've really had to develop their shadow side over the course of this period in order to read some of those signals. And those who are high on EQ need to vary their techniques and do things a little bit differently because they know there may be an issue, but to get to the bottom of it, they need to try something different.
Yeah, that's a great point. The EQ, the empathy, the emotional aspects of leadership have become more important. And Sally, we also know that during this crisis, mental health has become more important. And a lot of people have been struggling with not just the physical aspects of the pandemic, but the impact on their mental health. What advice would you have for managers and leaders that are trying to cope with mental health issues?
Yes, thank you, Anne. There has, and it's been particularly seen in the sector where I work, in the legal sector. For managers and leaders, not just in my sector, but in all businesses, the first thing to do is to be open to the fact that actually employees who are not taking off the very simple things, showing themselves on camera, have issues going on. And it's anxiety. The second thing is to ask. The telephone call, which was just referred to, is a brilliant step to just have a conversation so that there is no pressure about putting on lipstick and brush, because unfortunately we do still judge, although it can be a sign of what's going on in people's mental health and their well-being as a main. So that's the second thing for managers. If it's at all possible, managers should try and have a one-to-one. So we've introduced something in Women in the Law called coaching circle, to try and have leadership skills on a one-to-one basis in a group forum. And I hate to get all loyally here. We don't end a position where we're dealing with disciplinaries and dismissals, which are expensive for businesses, quite frankly. And so managing people out, I always think, I'm a bad lawyer if I don't just encourage litigation, right? But the reality is we're at a time where we've got huge redundancy issues in any event. The economy is, businesses are struggling. So let's actually invest in the staff that we've got. So I would encourage leaders and managers to have those open conversations and not to be afraid about suggesting means for people to deal with anxiety. Because much anxiety is developed over what's going to happen. Well, actually, the state we're in, it's a state we can't affect. So employees can't affect the effect of the pandemic, right? So that's the very first thing. It's not for managers to kind of counsel, but I think we need to be aware and provide provisions when we can so that people have access to those provisions. So we don't spend all our time trying to do the counseling, which will actually affect badly. But I think managers need to be honest and open and ask them, have they been for a walk? Have they had any fresh air? Have they taken their daily activities? It all sounds rather basic, doesn't it? But this is going on in different parts of the workforce where people are just stuck on screens all day long. And actually, in some sectors, certainly in the legal sector, our male colleagues struggle the worst. And so they're still working at 8 o'clock in the evening, despite them having the wonderful commute. So I think it's a difficult place for managers, but they need to be open and have those conversations. And that may be that actually they're not spending the time doing some of the, in the legal sector, we say billable hours. Lots of partners are spending time dealing with these well-being issues before they get to be doing the actual work. And so not being afraid and managers asking the questions and being open to that, it would be the first thing, and some of the other areas that I've covered in order to assist people with those anxiety and well-being issues.
Some great advice there, Sally. Thank you. Now, one of the findings in this report was that senior leaders, obviously have a key role in setting culture, but a lot of them think they might be doing a better job of modeling the right behaviors than their direct reports do. Bruce, I wanted to come back to you and say, how can the board and senior leaders really work hard to role model and build the right culture and the right behaviors for their employees in this uncertain time?
Well, I think sharing the burden is a key part of this. So what happens in a crisis, of course, is the boards tend to lean in more. And I think that as this crisis has turned into a marathon, boards need to be conscious about the pressure that they're putting on executive management teams and occasionally to lean out more. But I think also boards can share the load of communication that we've been talking about. And we've been doing, in most of the places I work, a lot more employee engagement, employee communication. And I think other board members can share that load by joining in and sharing their experience. And I think many board members, of course, sit on multiple boards and are involved in many different kinds of organizations. And so sharing experience here where we're all learning how to manage, I think is incredibly valuable as we try to get to best practices out of our shared experience going through this. So I think there are a number of ways that boards can really leverage their experiences to the benefit of the companies in which they operate, and particularly in supporting a very stretched executive team through this extended crisis.
Yeah, that's an important point. And Maggie, you once gave me a tip that I actually used and I thought was a great way of encouraging engagement. You said, ask your teams what makes you mad, what makes you sad, what makes you glad, and listen to the answers. I found that a wonderful tip for engaging employees. What else have you seen that really works in terms of building engagement for teams in this crisis?
I'm really happy that you also love that tip, Anne, because over the course, since we last had that conversation, like the repetition of that process within a lot of the micro teams and obviously macro teams in which I'm involved has genuinely led to a shift in the depth and trust within the relationships, like irrespective of the digital world. So I think the other things that are really helping are that, number one, as we've talked about and the findings in the report bear out, trust is paramount here. And I think about this a lot and discuss it with my teams, in that it's not our role as leaders and as managers to sugarcoat things. It's our role to empathetically and respectfully and transparently be clear about the consequences of the economic environment we're in, and then to create the opportunity to co-create what is our collective path in the context of our individual businesses or the ecosystems of which we are part in moving forward. And the reason I've mentioned ecosystem is, I'm a very, by nature, I'm an optimistic person. And one of the things that we're finding useful internally is that we're trying to shift the tone of the conversation now to less reflective as it needed to be at the beginning of the pandemic, to create the safe, psychologically safe space to understand how everyone was feeling and to bring your full self to work every day, to now that kind of shift forward to what are we collectively going to do about it, and what new opportunities for either collaboration, for new business models. A person very involved with, say, circular business models in our day-to-day work currently, and it provides an opportunity for a very different conversation with customers about shared opportunities, shared challenges, emergent business opportunities. And that can also have a significant impact on the depth of the relationship between one's company and one's customers as well. And then I would say more micro things is that we're trying to be really creative internally, like personally. And I loved what Sally said about, like, well, are you actually checking that you're going outside? Even I realized there was a day a few weeks ago that I was in this room for 14 hours. And I said, that is nobody else's fault. That is Maggie Buggy's fault, So I've introduced now in my diary, like, this kind of walk and talk session, so that with my one-to-ones, and then when we go out to I live near Bushy Park in London, that I go out and I walk around the park. Now, granted, that an issue last week when a deer came up when I was in the middle of a very sensitive conversation, but by and by, it has really led to a shift in the conversations, but also people going, gosh, I didn't think about that. That's one thing I've been reflecting on, that maybe in this time, what are our real boundaries and what are our imagined boundaries? And do we need to constantly step back and say to ourselves, what type of new ways of engaging am I falling into, and what others should I be consciously moving towards?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I hope the deer went peacefully and didn't interrupt your conversation. But now it is actually, for those that may not know, International Men's Day today. And one of the findings of our report, and this is a question for Adam, yay, right, Bruce? Question for Adam is that working fathers actually have told us that they really do want to keep working also from home at least one day a week after this crisis. And many people say that actually many men have discovered different ways of leading and discovered more about what actually goes on in the household than they knew pre-crisis, perhaps. What are your thoughts on that?
Gosh, it's an incredibly complex area, Anne, but I think you're right. The research is it really showing how much more involved and engaged many dads have become over the last year or so. I think the first thing I'd say, though, is there's no doubt about who has borne the brunt of this crisis in many family relationships. All of the evidence shows that it has been women who have taken on more childcare. It's women who economically are disproportionately more affected as well by job losses in particular sectors, etc. I don't want for a minute to minimize that, but I think for a lot of dads, there has been a feeling that what they're going through during this time has been a little bit invisible. It hasn't been shown in the media very much, etc., because they're going through a change too. So I think one thing which is very good is for dads to see role models amongst leaders and managers, and for leaders and managers also to be checking in with their people, their male employees, about how things are going for them. It may be a little bit different to some of the interactions they will have had previously with these employees, but I think they value that right now. One thing that came up for us, for example, from male employees with child caring responsibilities, meetings at 8:30 in the morning, 8:30 to 9, and at around 3:30 in the afternoon at this particular moment in time are difficult for some because they're trying to help with homeschooling of their children or have drop-offs and pickups that they're trying to do. That's just one very small example, but where a small shift can actually help fathers be more engaged and feel like they have the bandwidth to contribute in the family and to deal with their working responsibilities. I think with male employees, though, sometimes it can take more to get them to open up. It can take more to get them to express what it is that they're feeling. And it requires a different skill set from all of us than that we've used in the management toolkit in the past. Where possible, if you can get out and take them for a walk, as Maggie was saying, virtually or physically, if you live close enough and you can do it in a socially distanced and legal way, do it. If you note that someone's under a lot of pressure, make that informal phone call that Sally was talking about a little while ago. There are a lot of techniques and tools, but sometimes I think with male employees, you may need to coax it out of them a little bit more than you might have done for others.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we'll come back to whether or not you think the empathy that we've been experiencing now will carry into the future post-COVID. But before we do that, Sally, one of the other findings we found is that diversity, and a very important thing for 10% of those we asked pre-crisis, is now only important for 7%, but actually when we asked that question of Black employees, 35% said it was important. Now, what do you think we need to do to make sure that diversity remains an important aspect on our agendas, especially as we know that the crisis has also disproportionately affected those from diverse ethnic backgrounds?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I probably can't go through everything in the webinar, but I noted actually also in Lord Mark Price's video some of the issues he talked about. So all of us have felt this intrusion, managers and leaders and just employees, since the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And the hashtags have become less. There are no more black empty boxes where nobody goes on social media and protests, and there are less protests or no protests. And so it's very much become a business issue. And so the question is a good one. Lord Price was talking about walking the talk. Actually, I prefer deeds more than words. I've stolen that from Emmeline Pankhurst, the suffragist. And so I think what managers and leaders really now to do to keep the conversation going, because 35% is a large figure, I noted that, it is actually continue the conversation. Don't just have the diversity days where you have a tick box where you get somebody like me to come in and tell you all the bad things. You know, it's great, I'm happy to do it, but actually measure the impact of having these events and conversations, and have the difficult conversations. Race is a difficult, anybody who says is not, is talking, I can't swear on here, it's talking nonsense. It's a difficult subject, and our relationship with race, we haven't all had this conversation. So it's important for employees to have the conversation and discuss how to be better allies, which is something we don't often talk about. How can the employer be a better ally? How can the working relationship be a better ally, so that the responsibility is actually back on the employees who can feel empowered to say so. So that's one of the other things. I think mentoring, sponsoring, I prefer sponsoring than mentoring. I know CMI have done loads of work in these areas. So, you know, people can go back and read some of the older reports if you like, as in last year and the years before. Because the same applies to gender. Better mentoring, better sponsoring, which is a clear difference. You can have mentors, but if it doesn't lead anywhere, then it's completely pointless. But if you don't have a mentoring scheme, start one and ask the Black and have reverse mentoring. So that's the other thing. I think look at the progression. For me, it's about seniority. Okay, so in my sector, my day-to-day job, the legal sector, brilliantly, we've got more women entering the profession than before. But you've only got to look at the Supreme Court to really look at what's going on there, right? So if we go back to the businesses that we deal with, and I look at the boards that I sit on, we've really got to look at actually, is there diversity at the top, and how are we role modeling that? And again, and I'm not talking about tokenism, I'm a bit controversial about this. Don't just employ a Black person who takes the box, completely pointless. Because actually, if they can't do their work, achieved very little. I'm using plain language and we all understand the nuances. Think about recruiting a capable leader who is diverse, who can actually carry the message of your company and the firm and the objectives down to the lower workforces. And that way, you role model that back up so that actually what you end up having is people who have ingrained and have been brought up in those businesses to be leaders at the top. Buying in very rarely works materialism. So that's the other thing. The other point that I just wanted to make was about carrying on the conversation. Okay, as time goes on, it is very easy. We've got Kamala Harris, right? So I'm thinking, job done. You know, she's not even a Brit, but we've all adopted her, right? And you know, it's the best news we've all had. Actually, she's American and she's quite a tough prosecutor, so it's not job done. I think we need to carry on the conversation so that we don't look back and think, oh yes, Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, all of those issues are all done. It's important for us to carry on and not necessarily all the time in a heavy-hearted way. Sometimes we just need to acknowledge Black history, for example, is everyone's history. You know, simple things can really have the conversation. So that 35% was stark, I noted in the report. But I think that managers and leaders shouldn't be afraid to ask the conversations and have the conversations and be ready to ask, how can we be better allies?
That's a great point. And for those of you watching that want to ask a question, we will be taking questions. Please just put them in the chat box on your screen, and we will be getting to those shortly. And for those of you that want more advice, as Sally said, on how to continue the conversation, please take a look at our CMI race report that we published last month. It's full of a lot of advice on how to do this. It's a really important point that we keep that up. Now, I'm going to ask each of you, before we get to the Q&A, we also know that this crisis has been toughest for young people. You know, their anxiety has increased. They're going into a terrible economic situation at the start of their careers. Their school lives have been disrupted. What advice would you give to young people, or what do you think employers and others need to do to get young people back on track? Bruce, if I could start with you, but I'd like to get each of your views on that.
I suppose the key issue for me is young people having the confidence to ask for help and support. When I was young, I used to think that asking questions was a sign of weakness. What I figured out as I got older is that actually it's a sign of strength. And I think there are a huge number of people out there willing to offer advice and support, but they need to be asked. And so if you have the courage to ask, I think you'll benefit from a huge range of experience. And the great thing about asking for advice is that you don't have to take it, but it all feeds into your better understanding of the world of opportunities out there. So find a mentor. We've talked about mentors and sponsors, but even go more broadly than that. Think about your networks, think about people you know, think about the parents of people you know, who might be able to help you and give you insight into how to either get a job, keep a job, develop within a job. So much of this, even before the crisis, is about individuals taking more responsibility for their own careers anyway. And we've talked about that a lot at CMI in recent times. And the challenge is, how do I know how to take care of my own career? And the best way to do that is to go and find some people with grey hairs who've been doing things for a bit longer, who've had more experience than you have, and ask them, what did they succeed at doing? What did they fail at doing? What would they do differently? How did they keep their skills current? How did they make themselves relevant to employers? What tips do they have about how you should progress in life? And I think there is really a wealth of experience out there, but we struggle sometimes to channel it, to connect to it. And so I would advocate that for younger people, but I would also advocate that more senior people, more experienced people, have the obligation also to reach into the world of younger people, to be offering that help proactively. And I think we genuinely need to reach out and draw these people in, because you're absolutely right. The osmosis process of learning that happens when you're just proximate physically with people in the workplace is not happening at the moment. And these individuals can end up feeling very excluded, and of course they're much more vulnerable to the vicissitudes of unemployment going through this period.
Absolutely. Maggie, what are your tips on how we can prevent this for young people?
So for young people not who are looking for their first role, I would say use the tools available to you that and the methods that you are actually more proficient at than anybody else. And I would say that a few weeks ago, a young person had obviously used sentiment analysis across my digital channels, had worked out some of the things that I'm passionate about and that are important to the business I'm part of, SAP. And instead of reaching out going, "Hi, can you help me? Let's be introduced," this individual had gone and had taken some time to develop like some insight and thought leadership and some recommendations of how SAP could expand our focus on the circular economy beyond Ghana, which is what we were, the piece was on, and actually apply it across Southeast Asia. And that person sent this to me. So I would say for individuals not yet in work, be creative and use the strengths that you have and the tools that you have to get someone's attention. For young people already in the workplace, we have a huge focus on this at SAP. But I would also say that and I agree with Bruce that it's about the individual action around it. Well, be demanding. And I'm blown away by our graduate community globally. We're doing lots of virtual meetups, and again, on the positive side of it, it's offered a different opportunity for connection. Maybe historically, I would have mostly spent time with the graduate communities in the UK, because although in a global role, this is the country in which I'm in, or in Germany, because I go there so much. But now in COVID, my gosh, this year I have been with the graduate intake in South America and LATAM. I've been with North America. I've been in China last week. I've been in Sydney, last month. And I mention that because there are also different opportunities to connect. And also we talk a lot about opportunities for employee voice. Well, thinking about the problem and opportunity a bit more creatively. This crisis has provided a platform and then the shift to digital for different voices and perspectives to step forward, be that, and in this context for young people, their creativity, the fact that they are unencumbered by, the experience that Bruce has alluded to, means they have a different freedom of thought. So within your organization, create forums and advisory boards around topics that are relevant to your company. And that's what young people across SAP have been doing, be it in the context of the use of intelligent technologies, be it in the context of how we make our company resources available to our communities, to governments, to industries, to help them survive and move forward to thrive in this crisis. So they're the two. I could talk about this all day, so I'll pause there because Adam and Sally as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Well, hats off to the young person that used digital listening tools to tell you how to expand what you personally were interested in. Very clever young person. But Adam, what's your advice? How can employers help young people get through this crisis and weather it?
Well, I agree with Maggie Ann up to a point in terms of the fact that we can go out as, very privileged white collar managers to various places around the world and engage and interact with young people and young intakes. But I think for a lot of people, young people in particular who are coming into the workplace, geography and place still very much matter. The likelihood is that they will get their first role very close to home, and it's those businesses who are closest to home that will be most important in engaging with them and helping them make that transition successfully. So I guess there are 3 or 4 points I would want to add to the discussion. The first is, if you're a business in an area where you don't feel like the local FE college, for example, is giving you what you need, go bang down the door. There's no excuse for businesses complaining that the education system or the training system isn't providing what they want if they don't then go in and engage. And we know there's still many hundreds of thousands of vacancies out there. So making sure that supply and demand are clicking together is something that businesses can do. And I know chambers of commerce are also hugely involved in locally as well. The second, consider apprenticeships again. 70%, I think, is the decrease in the number of starts in apprenticeships that we've seen here in England alone over the course of the pandemic. That is an emergency in a lot of respects. Developing talent by engaging with this system and taking young people, whether they've just come out of school or they've come out of university, or indeed if someone is mid-career and wants a change of career, this system is there, it's strong, it delivers results, and we need to use it. The third and final point is there's also the Kickstart scheme out there for younger people. Now, Chambers of Commerce already have got, I believe, almost 10,000 businesses to commit placements, 10,000 placements out there across the country, across GB. Now, imagine what we could do if all of us were saying that we would take one of these young people on for 6 months and give them some of that rich tapestry that Bruce was referring to earlier of experience in the workplace. We collectively could make a difference and prevent some of these young people from feeling isolated and somehow alienated from the workplace. A final point, Anne, there are a lot of young people who are, of course, already in our businesses as well, working between, say, the ages of 16 and 25 in businesses around the country. Many of them might be most likely to be experiencing isolation or to have substandard conditions in terms of working in their bedroom or off an ironing board or whatever else it might be, right? We have them a special duty of care for them, I think, and we need to use all of the management tools we were talking about earlier even more with them over the months ahead.
Absolutely. And we're going to get to questions in just a moment, but I want to ask Sally finally her advice. How can we help young people get through this crisis?
Well, I've got a few things to say about this. Firstly, Bruce said, ask the people who are grey. Well, listen, as soon as this lockdown is over, there'll be less grey people like me because we've never appreciated our hairdressers as much as now. So we'll be back there. Bottle is not good enough. I'm not ready to go grey shamefully. So, yes, look for us greys, but maybe, do a deeper research after the end of this, the 2nd of December. I'm very concerned about this, clearly, and about the young people, and even from the basics of them gaining work experience. So, of course, we're going to have a surplus workforce with people with much more experience than the young, and so they're worried just about those. So, the points I've made on this, and Maggie's already covered some of this, I think we need to encourage our young people to use the technology that they are so much better than us. TikTok. If you've got young people in your companies, ask them to create a TikTok. I don't say that because I know how it works. Of course I don't. But there are other platforms, Instagram and businesses. And I think that actually what we actually failed at is encouraging them to say the positive messages. We pay marketing people out of money to do all this. No, get the youngsters, they may well be interns, to be talking about the positives that companies are doing, for example, on well-being, fundraising, all those things that actually businesses and clients want to see. They want to see that you are doing something about Black Lives Matter. They want to see that, you are walking for male suicide for 30 days. I know I did that and it killed me. But I think that use the technologies that they've got. Snapchat, how on earth that works, who knows? But the technology is interesting, right? What happens to the data? So I really think we need to encourage young people to teach us. It's a bit like, reverse mentoring. And yes, of course, find the experienced people and ask them for help and say, this is what I'm thinking. And if a young person approaches you, ask for their CVs, and we should really encourage them from the beginning. So Adam also touched on this already. I think there's a variety of ways that we need to be clever about it. Otherwise, their futures will look bleak. I'm quite a positive person, but I think we've all got a responsibility to ensure that actually this doesn't have the detrimental impact that is actually expected, that the evidence shows, by getting them to use the stuff they are good at. They are good at using the technologies I've already mentioned. And the LinkedIn
that's some really great advice there. And I'm sure, I hope that lots of you are inspired to make positive TikTok videos about what companies are doing in the crisis. Now, I want us to have time for questions and to I'll address those questions, but to share some of the questions that have come in, I'd like to ask Matt Roberts, CMI's Director of Membership, to join us to share some of those questions. Hi, Matt.
Hi, Anne. Thanks very much. Yeah, we've had loads of great questions. So thank you to everybody that's either submitted a question or indeed those of you that have liked the questions that others have provided. It really helps us to understand the most popular questions this morning. And just kicking things off, Anne, the first question is from Roxana, and she asks, what does the panel think to calling your staff online through video calls without warning? Should we be texting or writing first to give advance notice of those sorts of video calls?
Wow, that's a great question. Let me start with Maggie. What do you think?
Oh, I empathize with Roxana here and the sentiment behind that question. We actually were chatting about this in one of my teams last week, and we were saying that we use Microsoft Teams globally, but that it's like in some cases dopamine hits, and in others it's like kind of it totally breaks your concentration to have the constant ping and interruption. So I think it's hard to get the balance, but I do have a strong opinion on this, and it's not just my opinion; it's a data-driven opinion. Gleaned from polling some of our teams on it, that it's akin to walking into the physical world meeting and going, excuse me, I've got a point to make, when an agenda is in flow. So in the virtual world, it's the same. I think Adam actually mentioned earlier, it's like this is a realization in lockdown that it's a lot of the old world rules of great management and excellent polite behavior equally apply in the virtual world. So therefore, it's setting clear expectations, being clear about what a meeting is for, what's the objective, what's the outcome, and do you really need a cast of thousands, or do you just need a few experts and a decision maker? So thinking consciously about the use of time and more importantly, the consumption of other people's time, and always checking yourself, holding yourself to account rather on the objective of the session, and then thinking about the channel. Does it need to be video? Does it need to be voice? Does it need to be?
Yeah, you wouldn't barge into an office, you would knock if the door was shut. So I want to get as many questions as possible. Matt, you said there are a lot. What's the next question?
Yeah, absolutely. Our next question comes from somebody who hasn't given us their name, unfortunately, but they say, in a department that's already really stretched for time, how do we encourage taking time out for well-being without inadvertently adding in time pressures and stress?
Right. Well, Adam, how would you deal with that?
Well, we've faced this difficulty. My business is very stretched at the moment because we've had to both get our business on its feet again, and of course try to represent other businesses at the same time. We've come up with a few things that work, but I wouldn't say any of them are conclusive. One is, particularly in these winter months, ask everyone to book some time away from their desks while there is light outside. Light is very important to all of us. If you don't take the time during the day, it is not good for you and your productivity will go down. A second one is trying, not always succeeding, but trying to move as many calls and meetings as possible into a set of core hours, and trying not to encourage or hold conversations outside of those core hours. That does help, because one of the things when employees are stretched that they need is time to actually do and to think. And being connected to a video camera or to an audio call does not necessarily mean you are thinking and being productive to the best of your ability. You need time away from that too. So being disciplined and trying to create that space is important, and actually it reduces the feeling of stretch because you're not on your computer at 8 or 9 o'clock at night with that spreadsheet or that document that you may not have finished during the day.
Yeah, that's a great point. So Bruce, from your perspective, how do you think we can create space for well-being without stressing people out?
Well, I think first we ought to rely on some of the knowledge we already have about this. So day-to-day life pre-COVID was pretty stretched in terms of people's demands on our time, and we learned how to prioritize on the things that are important and often to change our priorities depending on circumstance. And so I don't think we should throw away all of our experience when we transport this to the remote working environment that we're now in. The second thing is, I think, in support of what Adam has said, I mean, what we've been trying to do at Lloyd's, for instance, is to persuade people not to hold internal meetings of any kind between 12 and 2. every day. So have the meetings at a different part. 12 and 2 is the daylight hours, and so that does give you an opportunity either to get away from your desk to make some lunch or to go for a walk. And frankly, even if that pushes me later into the evening, those are dark nights, and there's not much marginal time lost by being on Zoom when it's dark anyway. And so you can create boundaries, I think, in different ways. And Adam suggested some slightly different ones than the ones I'm suggesting. I think also, we've talked about this, but breaking up the medium of communication, not everything has to be a Zoom call. And I think breaking that up into different ways of working creates flexibility. I can take lots of phone calls while being out for a walk if it's on the telephone, which I can't do when it's on Zoom. And so thinking a bit more creatively about how we're engaging, particularly with people we know well, who we have to fit into our regular rhythm of engagement, I think can be very positive for all parties.
Yeah, a walk and talk. That's a great suggestion. I do it all the time. Matt, what's another question?
Okay, next question comes from Harry Griffiths. Can I ask the panel how they would improve staff morale so that staff can remain focused on achieving the organisational goals when perhaps they face their own personal concerns away from the workplace?
Great question. Sally, how would you address that? Maybe somebody facing redundancy or...
Yeah, it is a good question. Morale is very important. I was going to give a funny answer, which was cheese, but I'll change it to something a bit more serious. I said cheese because I think everybody needs morale in this whole crisis. So employees do just need some positivity. It may well be, I love cheese and some red wine. Of course, when companies are struggling, that's a real treat, isn't it? But the reality is, if someone is facing redundancy, I think we need to go back to the basics of being a friend. Of course, because we can't go into offices, the conversations about redundancy and selection and so on won't be taking place face to face. There won't be an opportunity to give people a hug or to say goodbye to teams. It's all over Zoom and internet and so on and so forth. So those anxieties are going to stay with staff, and the morale will be very low. I think one of the things is to continue the conversation and remember that we are human. Yes, these may be done over the internet, but actually carrying on the conversation that is not actually the person's fault. All those usual things we would have done in reality. Assuming it's not an acrimonious one, would be good. But I think morale needs some teamwork, regular conversations and chats. In the beginning of the lockdown in March, when all those quizzes have started and so on, and fundraising, they've all kind of gone down a death because the reality is now checking in, and people are concerned about Christmas and they've got personal problems in the household. So I think that to keep morale boost going, let's try and foster teams together. If it's a formal anxiety issue, such as dismissal or redundancy and restructuring, then those things need legal advice and conversations with HR, and actually companies should be quite good in getting formalities, just to be clear on that subject. But morale is a bigger issue, and loads of workforces are facing this. And perhaps maybe buying into those who are doing positive morale. In the law firms, for example, are having, connections to lots of well-being type organizations, so that at the very least they can say, we've provided this in a nutshell, and it's outside of the company. So if people have got funds, because it's often classed as a non-essential spend, well, when the suicide rates increase, and you find yourself hauled in front of coroners to give evidence about the death of people, spending 500 quid on a bit of well-being may have been a better way to spend it. So I think there are various ways of dealing with the morale issue. I've outlined some of them. And I think, yes, maybe the fun way, the better, really. And maybe that's not cheese. If cheese isn't your thing, I'm sure there's other things. Chocolate, I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great point. We maybe have time for one more question, Matt. What should it be? What's the question?
I think there's a great question to finish off, and that comes from Fiona McKinlay. And just before we go on to that, it's worth noting that we've got to note everybody's questions. There's some great food for thought that no doubt we will take forward with some of our follow-up activities after today. But Fiona asks, how do you deal with a senior leader who is focused on presenteeism and believes that everyone should eventually physically return to their daily 9 to 5?
Oh, okay. So how are we gonna cope with this person? I'll ask each of you that one if we can try and keep our answers as concise as possible. So, Bruce, how are we going to deal with this presenteeism?
Well, I think most of these individuals also have children, wives, husbands, etc., who are also experiencing COVID in different ways. And so getting them to think about the impact of this, not just on their traditional ways of thinking about work, but on how it's impacting their family and their networks, I think is quite important. I think getting management teams together as well to talk about these things is also important, because I think that then overrides an individual manager's prejudices on this issue. And I think finally being more proactive as management. We've been quite passive as managers because we're concerned about well-being and allowing people to work in the way that they've wanted to through the pandemic. But actually, I think we've got to posit the new future more articulately to our employees in terms of how much time we're expecting them to be in the office, how much time we hope they can be working from home. And I think in the absence of developing these kinds of policies, it allows individual managers to kind of exercise their own discretion, and some of that discretion is being exercised unhelpfully. So I would advocate for businesses themselves to begin thinking much more creatively about how they want roles to develop in the future, particularly in terms of remote versus physical. And then as an employee, you can point to those policies and say, look, I think there's an opportunity for me to work in a different way and to be equally productive. But ultimately, most of you know my view is that bad managers are really the pits. They're the worst things out there for any employee. And if you've got a bad manager, you've got to find a way to get away from that individual, because it's going to be poison for your career development.
Yeah, that's a great point. Very briefly, Maggie, what would you tell the presenteeism person?
Well, beyond asking them that the 1960s are calling and want them back, beyond that, I'd say two things. Number one, I'd focus on why, and I'm a data-driven person, so I would prepare for that session with asking them, why is this so important to you? But I would be prepared for that conversation with a data-driven framework of the outcomes and KPIs the business or team needs to deliver, and assurance and proof points of how that's working in any environment. And then I'd close off with, again, confirmation of their why in the context of the data.
Great. Adam, what's your advice?
Well, I had scribbled down ask why, so Maggie and I are as one, I think, on that point. Three things I think we do. Number one, where you feel comfortable, challenge them. We have a problem in this virtual culture, I think, where the hippo opinion, the highest paid person in the organization's opinion, suddenly sort of shuts up all other conversation. So if you can, challenge them. If you can't, as Maggie says, use the data to try to present the case in a slightly different way. But I'd add a third, which is boards can be a very important tool in this case. It may be the case that you have to get board members involved with their diversity of experience and background, who may take a more rounded view on this if there is a senior leader in the organization who is not moving with the times.
Great. And Sally, for the presenteeism person, what are you going to advise?
I agree with everyone in a typical barrister way. My question was also why, but I think we should look at the bottom line. We did some research about productivity, and I'm sure CMI did right in the beginning. I can't remember if it was CMI, about the productivity during lockdown and afterwards. And sometimes managers, will like that data. What has been the output during lockdown versus entering into the law firm? Yeah, this is a big issue in the legal sector, I'm afraid, who have been very slow, and it's been somewhat of a 50-50. Some say, well, we're not going to go back in the office until March. Others say, well, we expect our staff now to be coming back and being present. So it's not just sort of unique to certain industries, it's across the board. I would say, look at the productivity levels and deal with it in that way. Never mind all the emotional issues and the morale for finding out. But why do we require everybody to be present in the office?
Yeah.
And that's where we can achieve the same levels of productivity.
Yeah, and you're right, Sally. We have found that productivity has held up in this crisis, and it's especially held up where we see positive management behaviors like communication, like honesty, like empathy. So thank you all for some great contributions. You've been an amazing panel. We will be posting the recording of this, so if anybody missed it, they can catch up with it. And Matt, I think you're going to tell us now, if you've joined us, how you can stay with us for some networking.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the sheer volume of questions shows that the conversation needs to continue here. So although the formal agenda is now over, we're now going to go into a period of informal networking. And you can access this by clicking on the networking option at the menu at the top of your screen. When you do that, you'll see a number of networking rooms that are based around the management transform themes that you can dip in and out of at your leisure. Once you've selected the room that you'd like to join us in, you'll be asked very quickly just to add the name that you want to appear in your networking name badge. So please put your name and company in there. If you get a chance, take a very quick picture. That's all integrated into the platform. And then you'll be into the networking room where you can simply drag and drop your avatar, the photo that you've taken, to approach other people. And you can join groups of up to 15 people to continue the conversation within there. Really hope that you do that. And we're quite excited to show you this virtual networking solution. So very much hope to see you there in a few minutes' time via that networking link at the top of the screen. And if you have any difficulties at all, there's a very brief tutorial about this system as you enter. Hope to see you there.